If everybody could come in, we can get going again, or take your conversation outside. All right, so I want you guys to do all the really good stuff at the beginning so that people who are still outside get penalized. Screw those guys. Yeah, right. So welcome back. 1 second. So one of the things we've tried to do in this conference is alternate between traditional academic presentations and discussions in a different format. And so we have two this afternoon. And the first one, which I'm very pleased to have David Schleicher here from Yale Law School, who's going to be interviewed by Justin Marlowe. They did like a dry run on a podcast, I understand. So
this is the dry run.
Oh, this is a dry run for the podcast. Oh, good. And Justin, if you could hold out the book. This is David's new book, and we have copies in our bookstore here, and I saw a little sign about 20% off, and even in municipal finance, 20% is a lot, so help yourself. Over to you, Justin.
Terrific. Thank you, David. Good to see everyone, and thanks for coming out, and congratulations to everyone for 12 years of this conference. Really terrific and great to be back in person. Great discussions, and including the one that we're about to have. So as mentioned, I'm fortunate to have with us Professor David Schleicher from Yale Law School, and we're going to talk in a second about the book, which is I guess we could say a very linear, very structured, very methodical way of dealing with the chaos and nonlinearity and unpredictability of the world of state and local government fiscal stress. Professor Schleicher comes to us again from Yale Law School. He's taught at Harvard, he's taught at Georgetown, he's taught at George Mason, published widely on all things having to do with local government, including in particular local election law, things like land use, property law, and of course, state and local fiscal policy. You've seen his work everywhere from the Yale Law Journal to The Atlantic to Slate. He certainly makes everything he does very accessible to a general audience. And he has his own podcast, which we also mentioned, called Digging a Hole, a legal theory podcast, which makes you a fly on the wall for the kinds of conversations that go on within law school halls, which I think is exciting. I maybe can have that discussion too. But and as mentioned, he'll be appearing on our podcast, which is the Public Money Pod. My co-host Liz Farmer is here. So if you like what you hear here, come tune in and get a little bit more when we have him on our podcast very, very soon. So the book, again, is called In a Bad State, Responding to State and Local Budget Crises. It's with Oxford University Press. And just to start off, Professor Schleicher, give us a 30-second elevator pitch for why everyone here at the Muni Finance Conference should read the book, or at least maybe buy the book, if nothing else.
Thank you, but I won't promise not to be holding the door open at the end of it. Now, so state and local budget crises are an inevitable part of American political life. We have 50 states and we have thousands of local governments. And further, state and local budget crises, that is, say, either defaults or near defaults or what have you, are always an issue for the federal government as well as for state and local government. People who live in states and cities are also Americans, and so they're represented in Congress, and they have externalities. And so it's always been an issue for the federal government. So the book is about how the federal government has and should respond to state and local budget crises. To the extent that the literature and popular discussion of this issue has talked about it, which is quite extensively, it's mostly been about the issue of bailouts. Should the federal government bail out state and local governments, or should it not? But what this has ignored is that of such crises, that hasn't really been the operative policy question. The policy question has been how to allocate the costs between austerity and making creditors take haircuts. Further, the literature and popular discussion has mostly ignored the role of courts as policymakers in these areas. And so this book attempts to write a comprehensive set of the options available to federal policymakers in state and local budget crises and the likely effects of what their responses will be.
Terrific. So the old saying is that you can't short municipal bonds, but in effect, that's what you've done here with this book, and thinking of nothing else, thinking about what might happen or generating more interest in what might happen, and having a framework, having some thinking in advance about what that response might look like. So speaking of We want to talk about some of the historical background in the book, and we want to have plenty of time, I should mention here too, at the end for some questions from all of you, so be thinking about that as we go through this. You mentioned the framework, which you call the trilemma. I wonder if you could unpack that for us a little bit. You mentioned sort of the dilemma that bailouts and fiscal stress is often dealt with at the federal level, but it's obviously more complicated than that. You lay it out with this framework that you call the trilemma. If you could explain that for us.
Yeah, of course. So the trilemma, I mean, I'm stealing a little bit from Mundell Fleming, for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing. But the idea here is that when you realize that it's not merely a bailout, non-bailout dilemma, there are three possible harms. And the story of the book is that no matter what choice you make, it's tragic. And so the federal government might want to achieve three ends: avoiding moral hazard, avoiding austerity, avoiding recessionary, kind of Keynesian negative thing during recessions, and then avoiding harm to investment through harm to creditors. But it can't do all of those things. It can only do two of those three things. And so let me unpack that a little bit for a second. So if it does a bailout, we have obvious conversations about moral hazard, and that's something I feel like is pretty well understood. We'll talk a little bit about how I think moral hazard works if you're interested, but a little unconventional. The second would be it could force state and local taxpayers to bear the substantial amount of the harm of this, and I can talk about tools through which they would do so even above and beyond what you might have been kind of pushing back on sovereign immunity and other things. And this will avoid harm to investment and avoid creating moral hazard, but will be really bad for the economy and for people who need services during recessions, because these crises always happen during recessions. And the third and final, and again, this is kind of like the newer element relative to some of the literature, is that, why not force defaults? Defaults would reduce the amount of wouldn't create the same type of moral hazard concerns, at least in that way, and may reduce the amount of immediate economic harm, but would create harm to future investment. So why would the federal government care about this? Well, in order to unpack that for a minute, you have to talk a little bit about why the federal government encourages state and local investment. And the story I tell, kind of building on Barry Weingass and John Fairjohn, is that the federal government has always relied on states and cities to do almost all investments in anything future-oriented. From the first Congress, the federal government has been proven unable to directly provide and largely to fund infrastructure and other future-oriented investments. And why is that? Well, their story, which I am adopting here, is basically a district in Congress. Such investments devolve into pork spending, and also there's some informational harm difficulties of doing so. But the federal government still wants to support investment. And so it does so in ways that are direct, like the interest exemption on municipal bonds, but it also does so in ways that are indirect, and one of those ways is trying to avoid any individual jurisdiction from defaulting, because that will have contagion effects or other effects on other investments. And so these are three goals the federal government has and three potential downsides. And so the trilemma is that they have to choose between faced with one of these problems, they have to choose between one of these three bad outcomes: moral hazard, austerity, or harms to future investment.
Got it. We'll come back to the trilemma in just a second. In some ways, the book it's almost like two books in one in some sense. If you are a fan of the history of state and local budgeting and finance, and in particular of state and local fiscal stress and defaults, this is most certainly the book for you. There's extensive research going back. Lots of people who we're all familiar with make cameos in the book. Alexander Hamilton. We were talking a little bit earlier today about Dick Ravitch, Kevin Orr, and then maybe lesser-known characters, Justice Samuel Freeman Miller, for instance, in Iowa, all kind of contributing to this tapestry. We could spend the rest of the afternoon talking just about the historical part of the book, but I really encourage anyone who's interested in that to look into it. You mentioned a second ago some of the historical background that informed the trilemma. I wonder if you could maybe give another just quick example or two of some specific ways that this historical research contributed to your thinking about how to think about this today.
So I'm not going to use the example, but I do want to quickly mention Dick Ravitch, who passed away recently, and he was a big we taught a class together for a number of years, and it's inspired a lot of the book. So I'd say my favorite example of the trade-offs come in these kind of paired set of defaults that happened between the 1870s and 1860s and 1890s. So there were following a huge set of local governmental investments in railroads that happened kind of repeatedly from the 1860s to the 1890s. There were series of local defaults, huge numbers of defaults across the country, and it led to a huge number of Supreme Court cases about it. So the Supreme Court heard more cases about municipal default between 1860 and 1890 than it heard on any other subject. About 300 cases, a huge number of, and the Supreme Court. And there's a little bit of debate about this. The Supreme Court was in these cases was extremely pro bondholder. It made up all sorts of law. So the real challenge in this was twofold. One was that the bonds were, the law of the bonds was, they were written under their own state's law, and then state Supreme Courts would declare them unenforceable, which would mean that under the law in which they were issued, they were unenforceable, and the Supreme Court just said, we don't care what Supreme Courts say about state law, we're just going to make it up for ourselves. I'm not quite quoting, but I'm coming close to quoting. The other one was making people actually raise taxes in order to do this. And so the Supreme Court and then federal courts would go around empowering federal marshals to issue orders against local mayors to make them raise taxes, often in violation of their charters and other things. It's extremely it actually isn't the most amazing of my favorite of these is that at one point Alabama got quite tricky, and they did something that a few other states did, which was called corporate suicides, which was they would the city of Mobile was heavily indebted, so they created a new city called the Port of Mobile, and then transferred the ability to tax property in Mobile, about 95% of it, to the Port of Mobile. The Port of Mobile bought all of Mobile's assets for $1, and then creditors were left suing Mobile. And the court, the Supreme Court eventually just said, no, you can't do that. We don't know why, but it better be unconstitutional. But it's this extreme, but exactly why, by the way, that same legal issue is, speaking of Dick Ravitch, is like deeply, if you think about it a little bit, is very much an issue with the constitutionality of sales tax bonds. So from things like the Big Mac bond through Cofina and what have you, and I get happy to talk about that if you're interested. There's some real interesting legal questions there. But the Supreme Court took this extremely pro-creditor position. At the same time, the end of this period, almost all of the southern states default on their post-Reconstruction debt. So one of the things about the end of Reconstruction, the kind of white redeemer governments wanted to do was were called coupon killers, and they were trying to default on a variety of debt. They were making arguments, for those of you who are interested in the international finance world, that were very similar to kind of what we call odious debt arguments there. But they wanted to default on all the Reconstruction era debt because they said this debt was taken out on behalf of people who were not the real people of Alabama, and by that they meant just white people in Alabama. I keep saying Alabama. I really usually make Arkansas the example in all these situations. Arkansas has defaulted 3 times. I call it the American Argentina. Sorry, Argentina. No, it's so the Supreme Court did these two, and the Supreme Court, in response to all of these defaults, made up our modern sovereign immunity law. It had been extremely different before 1876, and had been much like the rules they were applying to cities in all of these 300 cases. And they made it up in order to allow for these defaults. And so what is the effect of this? Well, one of the effects on when we saw the cities default and the court enforcing against them, the story gets a little more complicated, but I don't want to go too far, is that this created extraordinary economic harm. Cities were forced to raise taxes and cut spending. We had crime waves throughout all of Iowa. We had huge economic costs during these recessions from the government cuts in order to pay back these railroad bonds. On the other hand, we had a real preservation of the municipal bond market that allowed for the kind of glory period of investment in infrastructure in the 1880s, 1890s. And so John Tieford, the historian, has this wonderful thing where he just says, of the city of Chicago, declared that the buildings needed to be raised 3 feet, and they were. He declared that the river needed to be reversed, Chicago River needed to be reversed, and it was. That the acts of the city of Chicago were like that of the Old Testament God. And this was all funded by the municipal bond. At the same time, because they allowed for Southern state default during this period, Southern states got this kind of an economic fillip. They didn't have to pay back the debt. On the other hand, they were barred from bond markets for 20, 30 years, which had real effects on their ability to borrow. So they're barred from New York and Chicago bond markets, real effect for their ability to borrow, real differentials in their borrowing costs. And if you wonder why all the infrastructure in a lot of southern states is new, well, because a lot of it wasn't there when it was old.
Yep, indeed. And as a resident of Chicago, I can attest that lots of things about Chicago are Old Testament. So to get to some of the what we might call modern application, right, or more recent application of this, which I'm sure is of interest to many in our audience here. So we have the framework, and then we have a series of tools, so to speak. You'd mentioned default, and we'll talk about some of those others in a second. In thinking about applying those tools relative to the framework, you really emphasize in the book 4 key principles, right? Those are prudence, balance, spreading, and resilience. Prudence, balance, spreading, and resilience. What about those 4 principles makes them paramount for you?
Really good. So to start off with, I want to note that these are all like what I would call second level goals for policy. The first level goal: should we do a bailout or not? Should we enforce austerity or allow for defaults? And I don't give an answer to whether what the optimal answer in all situations is. In order to answer that question, you need to have we'd have to agree about how to rate the future relative to the past. We'd have to agree ideologically across a whole number of dimensions. And each crisis is going to be different for another. And so I don't have a single answer to how we should think about that problem. Instead, I offer a variety of second level concerns. If you're going to do bailout, default, or austerity, what would be the best way to do any one of those things? And I kind of break the values I have into 2 categories. And one way I define by what I call the war games principle. The movie War Games, if anyone remembers, it is a strange game. The only way to win is not to play. Well, the only way to win a state and local budget crisis from the perspective of the federal government is not to have one. And so the federal government should try to build into whatever policy when it's responding to a crisis to try to make other crises less likely. Call that prudence. The second one was that how can we reduce the cost of, again, it's going to be inevitable that at some point over long periods of time and many, many, many jurisdictions that we're going to have some state and local fiscal crises. How can we minimize the cost? And I break that out in a couple of ways in terms of spreading, balance, and resilience. And I can talk about a little bit about what those values are, but the basic idea is that it's resilience would be ways to kind of allow the national economy to recover from state and local crises a little more quickly. Balance would be spreading it across as many jurisdictions as possible, because the marginal, there are increasing returns to harm from any kind of particular policy response. So those are the ideas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So let's talk then about specific responses and to particular crises. So we'll take, we could talk all day about the different types of potential responses that you talk about in the book, but there's a few that I think, again, will be of particular interest to this audience. So let's start with default. In fact, the chapter title is Building Better Defaults. If you can talk a little bit about defaults and the way that they've been practiced so far, and with some specific reference to Chapter 9, which you have some views on Chapter 9 that are, you have some views on Chapter 9. Well, let's have you share your views on 9.
Yeah, I do. I mean, so the question is, like, how can we build into any one policy responses some of these values? And so there are a couple of things I focus on when I talk about how to make defaults, or particularly how to make Chapter 9 better. One is allowing multiple jurisdictions in at the same time. And so what does this mean? So that one of the notable things about Detroit's bankruptcy is that at the same time Detroit went bankrupt, Detroit School District was bailed out. And this leads to some really weird. Detroit School District there's the same geographic boundaries as the city of Detroit, and this led to some weird outcomes. Like teacher pensions got 100 cents on the dollar, but police officers didn't. This is kind of weird. These were both promises the people of Detroit made on behalf of the exact same taxpayers, and we treated them somewhat differently. And the argument is that in many cases, when you see local fiscal stress, you're going to see it in lots of overlapping jurisdictions at once. So to take an example that, I'm not doing particular credit analysis here, but like one of the types of jurisdictions that people are like most concerned about is the city of Chicago. And the city of Chicago is the most indebted city per capita in the country. It's got one of the most indebted school districts. It's in one of the most indebted counties. One of the most indebted transit districts.
Okay, we got it. We got it.
Yeah. States, community college districts, whatever. And one thing that you might worry about is the interaction between these two things if we ever get to a crisis situation, so that the city might try to pawn off debts on the school district or vice versa. The jurisdictions may avoid making cuts in order because they think that if another jurisdiction is going to default, they're going to get some of the tax space in order to do so. And so coming up with a way to make Chapter 9 work for all of these would be to allow multiple filings in one case. And this is an idea a lot like substantive consolidation in corporate bankruptcy, for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing. Another thing that I think is a little more controversial, and maybe where you're picking at, is that I agree with David Skeel that we should probably create a state bankruptcy chapter. That would allow for Chapter 9 for states. The idea here is notable. I mean, so this has received a good bit of criticism, I think, as you might imagine, and I think you kind of indicated, I think, yeah. But one of the ideas is that states can default without bankruptcy. They're a little different from cities because they have sovereign immunity and because of the way the Supreme Court has defected sovereign immunity. And so the question is, like, what benefit would a state bankruptcy chapter provide? Well, the question is, if they can default anyway, well, why would they need bankruptcy? My argument is that bankruptcy provides a lot of important tools from the perspective of a higher level government towards them. And one of them is that jurisdictions that by giving some kind of neutral arbiter who's respected and gets to wear a robe and stuff, the ability to declare that this jurisdiction is somewhat different from other jurisdictions would provide a real benefit in reducing contagion risk for other people. And from the perspective of the state bankruptcy might provide them with an ability to avoid having to make choices about which creditors to pay, which might help them out of some political problems.
Sure. Makes sense. Another tool, bailouts, or another response, I guess we should say, bailouts. You go into some detail about bailouts as they've happened so far. What does a better bailout look like, in your opinion?
Well, so, I mean, it's like all unhappy bailouts are unhappy alike or something. No, it's or happy in their own way. No, the basic move I make in discussing bailouts, I do a couple of different things in bailouts, and I could talk about some of the things I think went well. I don't want to only be critical. I'm quite a fan, for instance, of Chapter 9, and so I could talk about some of the things I think of ways it works really well and ways that some other reforms people have suggested are not good. I could talk about some of the things that work well in bailouts too. But one of the things I'm somewhat critical of, particularly in our last rounds of a kind of COVID era, was the absence of any conditionality in the bailout process. The idea here is that if we want to use our crises to create situations to improve, to avoid future crises, we might have used this as in a particular moment in order to encourage better budgeting practices and other things going forward. So if we're going to have a crisis and we're going to never let a crisis go to waste, well, this might have been a real opportunity. And I could imagine this creates a real set of legal challenges. So conditionality is something that the Supreme Court has regulated quite substantially. Through the Sebelius decision, nothing. But I think that you can get around that, and you could imagine all sorts of types of policy responses that where the federal government was attempting to encourage greater state fiscal rectitude. These can range from simple to really controversial, and so I kind of provide a menu rather than a. But since you're encouraging it, I'm here. I'm going to say the more controversial ones rather than the one thing you could imagine is they could say, in return for some ongoing streams of revenue, like the interest exemption on municipal debt, you have to put covenants into your bond to promise to do certain things with respect to your budgets. And these would be enforceable by individual bondholders. So you could imagine things like the types of the budgeting conditions that New York State imposed on New York City after New York City's crisis, or even things that are more dramatic. So think a requirement that all states adopt volatility caps the way in their bonds, the way that Connecticut did in the lead up to the crisis, which led to Connecticut being kind of one of the great fiscal success stories of the COVID era.
Sure. And some of those are maybe less controversial, or at the face of it, less controversial and a little bit more technical. Again, channeling Dick Ravitch, you talk about accrual budgeting, for instance, as another.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the New York example I was talking about, which is now this New York State obviously has greater control over New York City than does the federal government over any, but through the use of conditionality, and then through the use of conditionality to require covenanting, you could create an enforcement mechanism that might succeed.
Sure. Talking about austerity.
Yeah.
And we could talk again all afternoon just about the austerity measures that you describe and talk about ways that could be done more effectively. There's a piece in the austerity chapter, I think that's of particular interest to this audience, and you talk about pension reform. We could talk a little bit about, that both the practical approach to be done with respect to pension reform, but then you also tangle with some of the constitutional issues, particularly at the states. Maybe start narrow and work
so
out broad.
it's in a couple of chapters, but yeah, it's obviously a big topic. The first thing I'd say is that I think people, largely speaking, probably not in this group, but out there, yonder, those poor benighted souls who aren't here with us today, misunderstand what's going on with underfunded pensions in an important way. And so what is a pension underfunding system? People usually understand it as some problem with two pensions that are too big. And that's not right. It could be that pensions are too big, or it could be that they're not big enough, and I don't have any real. But rather, underfunding pension is a way of borrowing without having to comply with your state fiscal constitution, debt limits, voting requirements. The idea is that you're able to adopt something that works in every way like that. You have legal responsibilities to pay, but you don't have to put it to a referendum. You don't. It doesn't go. It's usually good for your balanced budget requirements to underfund your debt, and so it's a state constitutionally preferred method of borrowing. And so it is and again, it is constitutionally protected either by a state contract clause or by a specific state pension clause. This has some implications for how we should think about what the pension problem is or is not. The first implication it has is that one of the things that it's borrowing, but unlike borrowing for a bridge, there's nothing associated with it. So that is to say, normally we borrow in order to get something. You borrow to buy a house, and you've got a house. Whereas pensions you're borrowing to have received services in the past. And there's some elements that are a little different from that. How you think about schools becomes a little complicated in that context, because you could think about that as an investment. But the broad idea is that what this means is that when we say we have a pension underfunding problem, what we really mean is that we're using a great deal of our borrowing capacity for non-productive investments. And so one thing you saw in the kind of post-Great Recessionary era, where we see a real explosion in underfunded pensions, is we should have been a period of just vast infrastructural innovation. We had low interest rates, high unemployment. It should have been the time for building bridges and roads, and everything should have been great. And I don't know, we should have had high-speed rail and teleportation and hyperloops or whatever. It would have been awesome. But instead, we used our borrowing capacity to underfund our pensions. So that's a way to understand what the underlying problem of underfunded pensions is. Ask a question about reform of pensions. So on one level, you see reforms that are very targeted directly at, if we have underfunded pensions, we ought to directly attack the pension underfunding problem. So many of you remember another dearly departed friend, Jim Spioto's idea of having a pension-specific bankruptcy system, or that the pensions themselves should go bankrupt. And I think this is bad and wrong, because they're debts like anyone else. They're promises made on behalf of the people of a state or a jurisdiction that are the same as other types of debt. And so there's no reason, and I think there would be real legal difficulties in isolating them one way or another. On the other hand, they often have legal protections that go above and beyond ordinary protections for bonds. And so for those of you who are interested in something called the California rule, which is a special protection that some, though not all, states apply to their pension systems, the idea here is that states cannot reduce the terms by which pensions are given from an employee's first day on the job. So that is to say, you should start work as a teacher at 25. You can never reduce the mechanism through which pensions are earned for the life of that person's career. And I think this leads to what I call unbalanced outcomes. So the idea is that, like, we might want to, if we're going to have to make cuts across the thing, we end up firing more people or reducing wages more than we do pension, and that's probably a bad outcome. So I think the California, and there's, if you're talking about some really complicated legal issues, it's completely plausible that in states that have adopted the California rule for pensions, those are now protected by the federal contracts clause. And so removing it, except on a prospective basis, would be impossible, even if you did a state constitutional amendment, which was discussed in Illinois. But it would be better if we had. Right. And it had adopted the same type of constitutional protection we see in states like Michigan or other places.
Right. Maybe do one or two more questions, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. Wondering if you might, stepping outside of this book specifically just for a second, in a lot of your work, you've talked about changes to local zoning, right? Zoning reform. And that's a kind of an implicit theme in some sense throughout the book. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the overlay there? Are there ways that in thinking about specific types of zoning reform that might alleviate some of the underlying fiscal stress that would hopefully prevent the need for this type of framework?
So I'm traditionally was much more of a land use scholar than a finance scholar. I think it depends a lot on jurisdiction. Right, so there's a lot of evidence that local zoning restrictions in aggregate have real macroeconomic effects. We've had conferences here where we've spent a lot of time talking about this, but they have really large effects by biasing where people live. The basic way these macroeconomic, and by the way, the size of the macroeconomic effects they find are so large that they're hard to believe. So the idea is that that if people were able to move to the jurisdiction where they had the highest wages, and this is all pre work from home and everything, that we could see that basically in these models, like literally the entire population of Nevada moves to Los Angeles if there was enough building, and the effect of that would be in some of these models to increase the size of the U.S. economy by a third, which is like. That's too big to believe, but even if they're off by, we talked about this, if they're off by an order of magnitude, it's still really big. And so it's these effects can be really, really large. In some jurisdictions, this means that that also face fiscal problems, that they could attempt to solve their fiscal problems by liberalizing their land use regimes. And so if you think about a place like New York City is imposing upon itself a limitation on the size of its economy by not allowing housing to be built. And you know this because rents are really high. I pay them; they're terrible, right? But and they might be able to address their fiscal concerns that way. On the other hand, the underlying implicit idea of the model is that if they do that, people are going to be moving from somewhere. And that might create fiscal problems elsewhere. And so and we see that in jurisdiction without change, like a lot of people moving to Texas away from California and firms in response to the more liberal housing construction we see there. And that has fiscal implications for California, but California is kind of choosing to bear those costs by not allowing housing to be built.
Maybe one more question before we go to the audience. You, toward the end of the book, in fact, I think at the very end of the book, you mentioned, the role of political polarization, ideological polarization, especially at the state level, as a contributing factor here. Talk a little bit more about that and how that maybe improves or does not improve the prospects for the kind of thinking that you call for.
So I'll answer the kind of analytical question before I get into the So the first one is that that one of maybe the biggest trend for those who study state and local elections is been what people call the nationalization of elections. That state and local elections have increasingly followed national cues in ways that are really, really, really dramatic. So the correlation in voting between state legislators and president have increased really substantially over time to the point that they're in the high 90s of percentage. It's just a really, really dramatic. And and by the way, no one thinks that's because people have strong opinions about their state legislature and then say, well, President Biden must be the same as my state legislature. It's not how it works. And so one of the implications of that is that it's not clear that much about that happens in state houses and in local elections, again, accepting nonpartisan elections, which is most local elections, but some of them are heavily partisan, so I don't want to get too caught up there. It's unclear that what they vote on, that has any influence on elections at all. And governors and executives are a little outside of this, a little bit. But it's though they're increasingly like that as well. And so this has really dramatic implications for how we think about the political feedbacks that we think might generally address or respond to fiscal crises. We generally think that if services get worse, people get angry, politicians get voted out of office, there's downsides to wasting money. And it's just not clear that that's true. I mean, it might be true in extremis under certain circumstances, but the prospect, particularly of legislative elections at the state and local level, is really, really, really broken. And so this creates real problems for state and local finances. So one of the sources of this, and there are multiple sources of this, but one of the sources is decline in state and local media has a real effect that we see when a newspaper closes, split ticket voting goes down really dramatically. So people just don't know enough to vote for anyone other than their national partisan friends, so why buy? And this has direct effects on borrowing costs, that jurisdictions, when a newspaper closes, borrowing costs shoot up. Why? If you're lending money to that jurisdiction, you suddenly know no one's paying attention anyway, and so who knows whether these guys are going to steal the money or whatever else is going to happen.
A paper that was presented at this conference.
Yes, it's a really dope one. And it has if you take that a little broader, you say that, well, what are the, this suggests that the nationalization of elections should have a increase on a systematic increase on kind of fiscal mismanagement going forward. And so we might imagine something like, I mean, not doesn't mean everything's being mismanaged, it just means that like relative, that it's a bad force, the absence of state and local democracy or the limits on state and local democracy would have a negative effect on state and local budgets. One of the things we might imagine that would circulate is that as it gets worse, like when we see crises, we're like unclear about the way the political system will respond in the way it has in the past. And so some of our mental models for thinking about how this might have worked in the past may not be true now. Now, of course, a crisis may shake us out of it. And so, you know, we'll see. One last thing, like what extent does polarization influence the kind of proposals here? So one of the things when I was working on the book, it was like the crisis happened, and like many experts, you get talked to a lot of political figures during a crisis. And one of the things that I realized was that our discussion of state and local fiscal crises, which again was front page news, right? So we're spending a lot of time talking blue state bailouts, federal state bankruptcy, which like, you know, on the cover of the New York Times and everything. But the ability to talk about it or kind of explain what the upsides and downsides of different proposals had kind of fallen into this kind of easy partisan rhetoric. And so I wrote the book in what I think of as kind of a relatively naive way, which is just like to say, hey, here are the upsides and downsides. I'm not, you know, trying to tell you what you should, how you should answer the fundamental questions of bailout versus austerity versus default, or mechanisms for default in case of bankruptcy. But we should attempt to do the one thing experts or whatever we are can do, attempt to do is lay out the cost and benefit in a neutral-ish way to both give politicians and also potentially voters, if they're paying any attention, the tools for assessing these policies. And so that's what the book's really an attempt to do. It's I think of it like it's an old-fashioned type idea of it's not giving strong form answers to how you should respond to these policy questions, as much as it's trying to create a variety of tools and values that you might want to incorporate into your policy responses, and leaving it to our political figures to figure that out.
Well said. We have plenty of time for questions, and I'm sure there are many. And yeah, so microphones are coming around. Please be sure to introduce yourself when it comes time.
Ken Haichu. David, masterpiece. Thank you so much. And it's just a brilliant synthesis of looking back at 250 years of history and making some kind of policy sense out of the whole thing. Other than your book, which didn't exist when I could have used it, where are these federal policies written down? And are they just in the DNA? Are they embedded in various Supreme Court decisions and laws? Or, because I don't get the sense that people gather at Treasury or the Fed or the White House and say, hey, let's get David's book out and figure out what to do. There is no sort of federal policy handbook or guidebook that I'm aware of.
I mean, let's hope that happens. No, it's no, I think that's right, is that you're talking about a variety of different policymakers using a variety of different tools and then thinking about it in kind of siloed ways, and there isn't a single method of way of thinking about it. And that's not unusual for this type of policy rather than others, that we make policy through a whole variety of different, the federal government is a they, not an it, and it includes lots of different ways of looking at problems, and there isn't a single. So, I mean, it's sometimes said, I mean, that one of the types of things that was said when people talked about the Great Recession, the federal policy responses, the federal government doesn't bail out states and cities, and this has been a long-running federal policy. Of course, this isn't true at all. You know, like, we're in Washington, D.C. I don't know how you want to think about what happened in 1995, but I think the best way to think about it is a bailout. And the federal government also, we think of Ford to City drop dead, but in fact, the federal government supported the Seasonal Financing Act, which is a form of federal aid. And then, and so it's there isn't a handbook. This is, I mean, this is, you know, it's like a prolegomon to a handbook. I don't know. It's but it's, but I will say that you get a lot of sense from officials that they're groping towards a lot of these answers. And so you see, for instance, to take something, now I'm going to talk about you, and I got to talk to you before I worked on this or while I worked on this. And when you think about something like the Municipal Liquidity Facility, you see that people understand a lot of these things, whether or not they announce it in the way that giving loans without giving conditionality is really dangerous for the federal government. So why was the Federal Liquidity Facility so unwilling to do what some policymakers wanted it to, which was like open the floodgates? Well, they were very, I'm not saying, I'm not quoting anyone here, but like the way to look at it from the outside is to say, well, the federal government had real concerns about doing so without conditionality, and the Federal Reserve isn't in a great place to do conditionality. And so I celebrate the MLF's kind of policy stances in the book, but for exactly that reason. So I don't think there's a guidebook. I think that to the extent this book succeeds, it will be in providing kind of some methods or kind of common language for talking about these things. But generally speaking, we don't provide guidebooks to federal officials. We appoint them and let them worry about it.
This might have a one-word answer. I'm Dan Bergstresser from Brandeis, but is there anything interesting or relevant going on outside of the United States when it comes to restructuring of subnational?
Yeah, really good. So the book to which you might think of this as a kind of a bookend with, which is one of the best books on municipal finance, Hamilton's Paradox by Jonathan Rodden, is all about it's a series of international comparisons, right? So it says we creates a single method for thinking about subnational debt crises across countries. And what this book does, in contrast with that book, is attempt to use variation across American history in order to pull out certain lessons, rather than doing the international comparison. And so the story in Rodden's book, which is again is that there's a real federal bailouts create a real, without federal kind of direct oversight of state finances, create a real problem he calls mixed sovereignty. And so the way his model works is something like. Ordinarily, we had this huge set of provincial default crises in the mid 1990s that created huge international financial problems on their kind of through their response. If federal governments see state and provincial defaults, what their normal response to do is to bail them out and then take over their taxing and borrowing decisions. This creates a problem, which you lose some of the benefits we might see from federalism. You don't get all the things you might talk about when you're kind of a college class when you talk about federalism, but you do get, and what you see in these countries is that there's a narrowing of spreads between provincial bonds and national, to the point that in many countries there's no difference between lending money to a province and lending money to the national government, because they're the same thing from the creditor perspective. And the U.S. is held outside of that. This is the other way you can go. And for Rodden, the really bad outcome is if you do bailouts but don't take control, because in that situation, then you're just going to be doing bailouts over and over and over again. And there are some things that this book kind of notes that it's like in the American experience, you have to think about it a little differently, and that some of the sources of why we encourage state and local borrowing are really different, because in most countries, many countries, infrastructure is a national responsibility as opposed to state and local responsibility. But if you're interested in the international comparisons, I recommend that book very much.
Mike Ivsick, Bancroft Capital. You kind of touched a little bit on it there, but my question was going to be, given your trilemma, how you would envision, and maybe some of the recommendations, your thoughts on where we stand with Puerto Rico and how you would get involved or not, and which of those, what changes for Commonwealth as opposed to one of the 50 states.
Really good. So so Puerto Rico, obviously, if you think about it, it's like we encouraged a default, or we allowed for a default and created a process for a default, and tried to create that. One of the things I think is really good about bankruptcy systems, of which more in a second on Puerto Rico, is that it allows for some balancing across. It gives some outside entity to balance between the size of defaults and the effect of austerity. One of the things you see with respect to Puerto Rico is that we made a whole point of not calling it bankruptcy. Puerto Rico, we have something, Title III provision, and this was because they didn't want it to create any risks for states. So that maybe if we call it something different, it won't have any effect on borrowing in other places. By the way, that's something you see with respect to capital cities all the time. So jurisdictions treat their capital cities quite differently. And so two examples. One is Washington, D.C. gets a bailout, but no one thinks because Washington, D.C. got a bailout, that means New York's going to get a bailout. It's kind of different. And you see Connecticut, I brought up Connecticut earlier. Connecticut agreed to pay 40 years of Hartford's debt. It's pure bailout as you'll find. Not just a bailout. But no one thought that it would have the effect of encouraging moral hazard in New Haven or Bridgeport or wherever else. There were also heavily indebted jurisdictions because the state capital is different. So we often kind of hive off some of these examples. And so, like Puerto Rico is a really complicated set of examples, and particularly because although we did create the bankruptcy regime, we then have this huge flood of federal disaster money that followed the federal disasters that came afterwards. And that kind of in some ways limited the efficacy of the oversight board. But I guess what I would say, the way I'd say about Puerto Rico is that it actually continued to follow a lot of the models. So the Puerto Rico Oversight Board is directly modeled on the New York and DC oversight boards, and they're a way to condition and reduce some of the negative effects you might imagine of both kind of the federal aid and also of bankruptcy. And so I think it's pretty similar in a lot of ways. That was my way. I didn't quite answer the question, so I'm gonna move on. It's hard. It's a hard question. Other questions?
Mark Jaffe, Cato Institute. I want to drill down a little more on your response about the American Rescue Plan Act from 2021. I think your point about there being no conditionality is really important. But the thing that bothered me about it was there was no variability. So we didn't look at which states and cities were most fiscally distressed or which were facing the biggest revenue loss from COVID. It was just pretty much everybody got the same amount of money.
Well, so that is a way of trying to reduce moral hazard. So that the reason that one reason you might imagine, and it had a little more directionality than, so it had some, the one that had absolutely none was the first big basket of money, which was just basically a population, but to benefit small states. And then, but the one we saw is that the money was given to every state, and the reason you'd give money to every state with a not targeting at fiscal kind of like real fiscal need is that if you target at fiscal need, you create a lot of concerns about moral hazard. Right, so that if jurisdictions get more money because they're more indebted, that might be a signal to future politicians or to lenders, which is usually the channel through which moral hazard works, that they'll be rewarded for being heavily indebted. And so the huge size of the ARP, when most people's criticism of the ARP state and local aid is just that it's too big. Right, and that had effects on inflation and yada yada yada. And I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm not going to but it's like that's the normal line of criticism. But the reason it was so big, or a reason it was so big, was to give enough money to jurisdictions to fill their budget holes. They did give a lot more money to jurisdictions that didn't have budget holes in order to avoid. And so you can think about the way we structured it as a method for avoiding or reducing the moral hazard effects of bailout, but with other costs.
Hi, Leonardo Meyer, WMATA. I just had a quick question. I know you probably dig deeper in the book, but you mentioned that in the 1860s through 1890s, there are a bunch of railroad defaults in local governments. And I just wanted to kind of know how that, what the funding structure was like to lead to all those bailouts. Or lead to all the defaults, I should say. Yeah.
So it's a really good question. So the story starts in the 1840s. 8 states and a territory default on their debts and one of the ways they responded to this was to pass we now call state fiscal constitutions, and they've evolved over time. But these were limits on the ability of state and local governments to borrow, state governments to borrow, and everyone then immediately said, "Oh heck," but they didn't say that. Who's going to help us invest in infrastructure? You don't have vast state officials, groups of state officials and state civil servants to build infrastructure. And so you start seeing these court cases that say, the most famous of this is Sharpless versus City of Philadelphia, where they say these state fiscal constitutions, which were both limited borrowing and limited investment in private infrastructure companies, which is the main mechanism for providing state, didn't apply to cities. And so then what happened was that cities became the main venue for investing in infrastructure. And so the railroad is the most important technology of this period. The federal government ends up providing huge subsidies to the intercontinental railroads. So they end up giving land equal to the size of Texas in land grants to fund intercontinental. But the American Railroad Network, that's not that valuable unless you have lots of spur railroads that go to all the farms that allow the farms to run. And so you see this huge expansion in jurisdictions borrowing money to buy stock mostly, although sometimes they did it in other mechanisms, in railroad companies to encourage them to go through towns. And the railroad promoters would go through a place like Iowa. And it was, for those of you who are Simpsons fans, it was a lot like the monorail episode. Monorail, monorail, monorail. I've got a few fans here. When I do jokes like that with my students who are all like 23 years old, it's like never works at all. They're like, what the hell happened? But we saw this huge run of investment in local investment in building railroads, a huge overexpansion, which led to a huge number of bankruptcies. And that's the normal story we tell about this period. When we start talking about the defaults, we end up in this where the states then said, again, oh heck, and started changing the law. And so the most famous case from this period is a case called Gelbke versus Dubuque, where the state had decided in 7 years earlier that localities could borrow to fund infrastructure. That it was not an illegal subsidy to private industry. 7 years later, after a bunch of defaults, they say, in fact, they can. They cannot do so, whether they cannot borrow, and these bonds are all ultra vires. And the Supreme Court was faced with a question of how to look at that backward-looking, that revision, and the court rules in favor of the bondholders. And so that's like the basic story about what happened, and it happened in successive periods because building railroads is literally the most important thing in the American economy at this period. It's not the most, so one of the things that's funny about this literature, I've always found, is that it's like very concentrated on itself. And so you'll see people write things like, the most important thing that happened in the history of American federalism in the 19th century was the defaults of 1840. You're like, I don't know, there was this whole Civil War thing that seemed like a pretty big deal. I don't know, it seems important. But the building out railroads was really, really, really important. And that's the broad story about we see the state fiscal constitutions followed by these court cases that allow for local investment, followed by a lot of growth, followed by a lot of defaults. Again, in like 2 or 3 separate patches where this pattern repeated, followed by federal court intervention, largely on behalf of the bondholders. Again, what actually happens to the bonds is a little more complicated because after these opinions, you can't get juice from a stone, and so there end up being workouts, and so they don't get 100 cents on the dollar or anything. But that's the broad story.
Maybe one more quick question, if anyone has one.
Would you talk a little more about the dimensions of moral hazard? And the reason I'm asking it is that the importance of moral hazard is kind of assumed. And I just wonder if, given history, it should be assumed.
Really good. So moral hazard's a really weird phenomenon. So the idea here of moral hazard, if the federal government gives bailouts, it will encourage future fiscal profligacy, and that's the kind of ordinary story. And it runs into some theoretical problems that you might run into. You might imagine that, even before we get into empirics, which is that one of the reasons we assume states and cities get into budget problems in the first place is that they're extremely short-term focused. They think, well, we'll take out a lot of debt now, and some other sucker politician will have to pay it back, but right now I'll get a lot of votes. And if that's true, then moral hazard can't really happen because moral hazard is also something that happens in the future. So why would we see moral hazard? And the broad story is that I think that moral hazard mostly happens through debt markets rather than through individual politicians. And the basic idea is that, and there's a great story about this. So after Hamilton's assumption of state debts, which is a bailout, there's a question of how would foreign lenders think about state debts going forward? And would the federal government stand behind state debts in the future? So the states start borrowing money like crazy. First, you got the Erie Canal, and that works out great. So everyone needs their own Erie Canal, and there are a whole bunch of investment in state banks. And after the end of the Second Bank of the United States, Nicholas Biddle is the head of the Bank of Pennsylvania. And he goes to London and tells all of the investors in London, this federal government stands behind states. Of course you can invest in the debts of Pennsylvania. like a year later, Pennsylvania defaults on its debts. This actually has an amazing denouement, this story, which is after both that default and the defaults of the southern states in the 1880s, when the U.S. Is owed a lot of money by Great Britain following the end of World War I. One of Great Britain's arguments in response to saying we shouldn't pay it all back is look at all the defaults made by states. And that story is because the investors didn't make any distinctions, or the government didn't make any distinction between, like what's a Georgia? Who cares? And this is the channel through which I think moral hazard mostly operates. And they have all the incentives to their long-term, yada, and all the things that you might work, which would create present-day fiscal considerations. And so you don't have the same kind of theoretical problems that you might imagine. So that's the channel through which I think moral hazard operates. How big an effect it is, it's like hard to say. So how much do investors or present-day politicians predict that this bailout will affect them in the future is a really difficult question. So did this bailout come because the mayor of this town is friends with the president or not? Well, then it might not be predictable. And so the size of the effect is hard to say, but I suspect it had happened through bond markets.
The book is In a Bad State, Responding to State and Local Budget Crises. Professor David Schleicher, thanks so much for taking time with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David and Justin. And as I said, there are copies for sale in our bookstore. I think we're going to go right to the next panel. So, Mark, if you want to, Howard's going to load the slides. And is Mark in the room? Yes. Mark can take over. Thanks.